Good morning, everyone. Nice to speak. On behalf of the University of Queensland and Sustainable Minerals Institute, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today. We pay our respects to the ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections with country and recognize their valuable contributions to Australia and the global society. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Dion Weatherley. Dion is a computational geophysicist at the JKMRC, mostly known for the use of high-performance computing to investigate underground mass mining, comminution, and mineral separation. However, Dion is also UQ's chief seismologist and operates the university's W.H. Bryan seismography station at Mount Nebo. After completing a Bachelor of Science in Physics, Dion joined UQ's Quakes Center, where he completed a PhD in earthquake physics and later took charge of the UQ's seismic monitoring activities. In more recent years, Dion has been appointed as the earthquake subject matter expert for the Queensland State Disaster Coordination Centre and regularly advises state government department on earthquake hazard mitigation. So it's no surprise that today Dion is going to share with us the 16th August 2025 Kilkivan earthquake, a celebration of 90 years of seismology at the University of Queensland. Please join me in welcoming Dion.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming along, both in person and hopefully a few people online as well. It's a great honour to be asked at the last minute, thank you, Belson, to present for the first time actually on earthquakes, even though I have managed to mention earthquakes in every one of my JK Friday seminars so far, as Tim will attest. This presentation is going to primarily be a very high-level, non-technical discussion of a notable earthquake that occurred on the 16th of August 2025, the Kilkivan earthquake. Hands up in the room, anyone who felt the earthquake? About 4 out of 30 or thereabouts. That's about the number of people that felt it, even though it occurred at a pretty reasonable hour of the day on a Saturday. In preparing this presentation, I was looking back over some of the historical documents related to seismology at UQ, and I realised that seismic monitoring at UQ started 90 years ago this year. And I'll talk a fair bit about that at the end of this presentation. At the risk of being accused of conflating correlation with causation, I couldn't resist the subtitle of a celebration of 90 years of seismology at UQ. Certainly for a seismologist like me, studying earthquakes in a place that doesn't have them very often, this was a very notable earthquake. So the presentation is going to touch on what happened on the 16th of August and why most of you didn't feel it, but many people did. We'll talk about the aftershock sequence that has been recorded to this date so far, and then get into the more general topic of why and how do earthquakes occur within the Australian continent, followed by touching on some of the topics related to earthquake hazard mitigation in Australia. And I'm pleased to say that Australia is actually pretty well prepared for damaging earthquakes when it's all said and done. And then finally, a bit of gratuitous navel gazing about the history of seismology at UQ. And as we will learn, a very famous name, W.H. Bryan, has been a very big part of seismology at UQ, all the way from the early days and through his foundation to the present day, as it turns out. Okay, let's hope this is going to work. Apologies if YouTube decides to advertise to us.
Meet the car that's built for every family adventure. Designed for ultimate comfort, equipped with advanced technology and
The largest earthquake in 50 years hit Queensland over the weekend. In an extremely uncommon event for Australia's Sunshine State, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck inland Queensland on the morning of August 16, 2025. Centred near the rural town of Kilkivan, probably saying that wrong, about 80 kilometres west of Noosa and 250 kilometres north of Brisbane. The quake hit at 9:49 AM local time and was shallow, about 10 kilometres deep. This was the largest onshore earthquake recorded in Queensland in half a century, catching residents by surprise in a region that seldom experiences noticeable quakes. Buildings trembled for several seconds, sending people scurrying outside in alarm. But fortunately, the event caused only minor structural damage like cracked walls and fallen bricks, and there were no reports of serious injuries. Power outages affected around 11,000 homes, though electricity was restored within hours. For a state known as Australia's quietest seismic corner, this jolt was both unprecedented in recent memory and a dramatic reminder that even stable ground can shake. Though damage was minimal, the psychological shock was significant. Tremors rippled hundreds of kilometres from the epicentre. Geoscience Australia.
Okay, I can take over for Geoscience Australia, I think. For the rest of it, my own personal story of feeling this earthquake was quite interesting in itself. I was cleaning and refilling my cat's water bowl at the kitchen sink when my phone gave a notification tone I'd never heard before. And I thought, what was that? I don't know what that tone is. But I picked up the water bowl and walked around the other side of the breakfast bar, and I leaned down to put the water bowl down, and then suddenly the glass sliding door beside me out to the sunroom started shaking. And I was watching the shaking. I'm going, yeah, that's an earthquake. And it's pretty big, but it's not close. And then the next thing I noticed was it sounded like a possum running across the roof of the sunroom, but it went from north to south. And that was basically the slowest surface waves compressing and expanding the roof of the sunroom as that surface wave traveled through. So then I thought, I better get on the phone to Adam down at the Seismology Research Centre in Melbourne and see what he knows. And then I saw the notification on my phone. So when I got a new phone in 2023 and I was setting it up, I was looking through all the settings, and it said you could sign on for earthquake alerts. And I knew about it. It basically makes use of the accelerometers in everyone's phone. Anyone who opts in, the accelerometer data is being sent to Google in the instance of my phone, or Apple. They both do it. When a whole bunch of mobile phones in a region all detect a coherent signal, it sends out a notification alert out in front of the seismic waves. So I received the alert about 15 seconds before the seismic waves reached me. Of course, at the time that I set it up on my phone, I thought, well, why not? A bit of fun. I'm sure I'll never need it, which is the nature of seismology in Queensland. But it was very intriguing to see it. It had already started to try and identify where it was, and it was saying it was around Gympie. Adam got back to me very quickly, and he said, oh yeah, it's a magnitude 4.5 near Gympie. And I replied to him, said, no, bigger. And he came back about 5 minutes later after he'd actually relocated it rather than relying upon the computer to automate the location. And he said, yeah, you're right, 5.5, somewhere near Gympie. And that's what it was. It was a magnitude 5.6 on the modern equivalent of the Richter scale. In future times, that number will come down, but that will be because we will, sorry, gone too far already. I'm going the wrong way all the time. Whoops, don't do that again. Okay, yeah, magnitude 5.6 on the modern equivalent of the Richter scale. Eventually it'll be converted to what we call moment magnitude, which is a direct measure of the amount of work that earthquake did on the Earth's crust. And that's the magnitude that we will work with for future seismic hazard studies. This was, as the video said, the largest onshore Queensland earthquake in 50 years. But by the whole Australian continent standards, we have 1 or 2 around this kind of size every year, or 1 to 2 years. What was notable about this earthquake in the first instance was the reports of felt reports. One of the first things I did after determining that it was an earthquake was to sort of stand there in the kitchen and go, well, what can I do now as a seismologist in Queensland to try and maximise our ability to gather data about this? So oddly, the first thing I did is I went out into the ham radio shack and I got on the Sunshine Coast linked repeater system on VHF, and I put out a broadcast and say, hey, if you felt it, can you please go to the earthquakes website at GA and submit a felt report? I also sent out a message on a local peer-to-peer text messaging system called Meshtastic, and picked up most of the Brisbane region for guys that are playing with that kind of thing, and many of them also submitted reports, but so did a lot of other members of the general public. In fact, we got 24,445 felt reports in the first 24 hours after this earthquake. And as you can see, most of them within the first hour or 2. I mentioned this felt report thing because felt reports are something that we've been doing for a very long time in Queensland and Australia, and of course elsewhere around the world. Whenever earthquakes have occurred that people have reported, we've sent out paper forms for most of our time here in Queensland, and asked people to fill in a simple survey of where were you? Were you inside? Were you outside? Were you in a multi-storey building on the ground floor or on upper level? What did you observe? Did the windows shake? Did the chimney fall down? Those kind of things. And they've been the basis for mapping out what we call seismic intensity or macro intensity maps for earthquakes in the past through to the present day. In the present day, we have the internet and we can use online forms and automated systems that produce shake maps in real time or intensity maps in real time. So what you're seeing on the side here is not just a pretty picture, that's actually the intensity map that was determined from these felt reports over the first 24 hours. I want to make a note of this little bump where we got an increase in the number of reports coming about 22 hours after the event. I'm responsible for that. I'll take responsibility for it. On the afternoon of the 16th, the Saturday, the Sunday Mail had a journalist interview me for a 2-page spread in the Sunday Mail, and I made a big point in that article for people to go on the website and report it if they hadn't already. So that's the publication of the Sunday Mail there. As it happens, the 17th of August was a fairly auspicious day for me. As some of you will know, that's my birthday. As one does, as one gets a bit older, birthdays are just a reminder that you're getting even older. Thank you to the Sunday Mail for referring to me as a veteran seismologist. All right, so I guess I have to do this. Okay. So using all that felt report data, we can produce a more traditional style shake map. And this is what a shake map looks like. And all of these little dots that you see are individual reports from this earthquake. And those reports and analysing the survey forms that were filled in allows us to contour the amount of ground shaking. And we can do a conversion into peak ground acceleration as a percentage of 1G or 9.81 metres per second. And we can see that in the epicentral region around the earthquake, we're estimating about 20% of G. If that was purely vertical, that would give you butterflies in your stomach. You'd actually feel the effect of that as a slight drop in your weight. There have been instances of very large magnitude earthquakes over magnitude 8 where the peak vertical ground acceleration exceeded 1G. That means you get thrown in the air by that earthquake, which is quite astounding. And we've known about this since the 1950s when Gutenberg and Richter did a survey after a large earthquake in India, in Assam. And they came across a temple which had a statue out the front of the temple, and the statue was lying on the ground. The pedestal that that statue had previously stood on was still standing in place. There was a 2-metre long steel rod that was going up the middle of the statue. So that statue was thrown 2 metres in the air and about 2.5 metres laterally by that earthquake. Quite astonishing. Thankfully, it didn't happen on the 16th of August, but it can happen. So as you can see, the peak ground acceleration decays very rapidly with distance. By the time you get down to Brisbane, it's only 1% of G, which is not enough to be all that major concern, but it does shake the windows, as I said. Shaking was felt all the way down into Newcastle and parts of northern New South Wales, all the way up into Gladstone. So this is direct shaking felt by people. We usually map these things out using the Mercalli intensity scale, but in the interest of saving some time, I'm not going to go through that today. Instrumental seismic records. We had nothing within 100 kilometres in terms of seismic instruments, but that's pretty much always going to happen with earthquakes in Queensland. But we do have a relatively good national seismic monitoring network operated by Geoscience Australia. It's a combination of a number of different types of stations funded for different reasons. So the red triangles are part of the worldwide seismic network, which was established in the 1960s to monitor the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Australian National Seismic Network are the green squares, and those are placed throughout Australia to ensure that we can detect and locate every potentially damaging earthquake, magnitude 3.5 and larger, that occurs within the Australian continent. So that's the backbone of our rapid response. And we'll be able to find where those earthquakes are and roughly how big they are within 5 minutes. It's operated in by a data centre in Canberra, which is manned 24 hours a day. It also does some work internationally with the Pacific tsunami warning capability as well, and the Indian Ocean tsunami warning capability. This is what some of the seismograms look like as you get further away from the earthquake. The difference in time before the first arrival, the P wave, and the secondary arrival, the S wave or shear wave. That difference in time increases because P waves travel faster than S waves away from the epicentre. The difference in time between the P arrival and the S arrival tells you how far away the earthquake is. So if you have 3 seismographs and you can detect that difference in travel time on 3 seismographs, you get 3 distances from each of those seismographs, and you can triangulate and find the epicentre, and that's how earthquakes are located. Now, as I mentioned, it was felt by people from Gladstone all the way down into Newcastle, but instrumentally, it was recorded throughout most of the Asia-Pacific, Western Pacific region, up into Japan, South Korea, I think that's Russia, across into Sri Lanka. New Zealand has a lot of seismographs for obvious reasons, so they all detected it. So seismometers are very sensitive instruments. They can detect magnitude 5 earthquakes across half the globe. Magnitude 7 earthquakes are detected across the entire globe. Okay, should we be worried about aftershocks? Well, we may need to be worried about aftershocks for this event, because so far this event has been a little bit short on aftershocks, which is a bit strange by the standards of other earthquakes that have occurred in Queensland and even others in very similar locations to this event. So there were a few magnitude 1-ish aftershocks reported by locals in the epicentral region very soon after the earthquake in the first couple of days. It took 4 days for Geoscience Australia to put together and deploy 6 aftershock detecting seismographs. So these are called rapid deployment kits. They pack them up from Canberra, bring them up, and then they lay them out around what they think the epicenter is. So you can see the locations of 3 of those, and there's a further 3 over on this side. They were already beginning to suspect that the location they had for it might have been a bit incorrect. We have a plus or minus 5 kilometre to 10 kilometre error bar on location using triangulation methods. The aftershock sequence so far that's been detected, primarily these ones during September, has actually been to the northeast of where we thought the epicenter was. So these aftershocks will generally cluster around the main shock. So the main shock was probably a little bit further to the northeast than near the tiny little town of Barrenbar that no one's heard of, and a little bit closer to Kilkivan to the north. What's disturbing about this aftershock sequence is the complete lack of aftershocks above magnitude 2. We would have expected some magnitude 3 and 4 aftershocks by now, but it's a bit quiet. So there's something to be learnt from that. Every earthquake teaches us something new about seismicity in the Australian continent. Why do aftershocks occur? Well, aftershocks are basically a response of the sudden change in stress that's occurred during the main shock. And that change in stress is not just a drop in stress. Some areas will have stress increased as a result of the earthquake. A simple way to understand that is to think if I have the fault represented by the contact between my 2 hands, and I slip like this, then on this side of the fault, in front of the rupture, I've compressed the ground. So I've increased the stress to a degree. Likewise, on the opposite side of the fault at the other end, I've increased the stress, and I've decreased the stress either end as well. So we get what's called butterfly stress patterns. So this is an example from the 1992 Landers earthquake, published in 1994, showing the stress changes due to the Landers earthquake rupture, which was a magnitude 7 event that ruptured up through here, and the locations of the aftershocks as little white squares. And you can see that predominantly when we calculate through elastic dislocation theory, the changes in stress that aftershocks occur where the stress is increased as a result of the main shock. Omori back in the 1960s, a famous Japanese seismologist, introduced Omori's law, which is a power law decay in the number of aftershocks with time post the main shock. And that's upheld by earthquakes all over the world. It's a universal relationship. Okay. Now, I mentioned that aftershock sequence of the Kilkivan earthquake appears to be a bit anomalous. This is a similar earthquake offshore of Bowen in 2016, magnitude 5.8. And you can see that in the first 50 odd days, which we're still into with the Kilkivan event, a pretty considerable number of magnitude 3 and larger aftershocks from that event, which we're just not seeing with the Kilkivan quake at the present time. So one of the first things that journalists ask me, but Australia doesn't have earthquakes, does it? Well, it does, just not anywhere near as frequently as at tectonic plate boundaries. This is a graphic of earthquakes larger than magnitude 3, or what we call potentially damaging, that have been recorded by Geoscience Australia and forming the Australian National Seismic Catalogue. And the different symbols and colours represent different sizes. We have had larger than magnitude 6 earthquakes, and I'll talk about a couple of them soon. But you can see that there are earthquakes distributed in and around the Australian continent. About 100 felt earthquakes every year, magnitude 3 and larger. A moderate earthquake like the Kilkivan earthquake, about 1 every 1 to 2 years. And a potentially damaging magnitude 6 or larger earthquake somewhere in Australia once every 10 years or thereabouts. How's my time? Not too bad. Okay. Why do earthquakes occur within the Australian continent and not just at the plate boundaries? So Australia sits quite comfortably in the middle of a tectonic plate known as the Indo-Australian plate. So India is up to the northwest of this diagram. It's sutured to the Australian plate. India, as you will probably know, has a rather famous mountain range to the northern part of India known as the Himalayas, where India is crashing into the Eurasian plate, which is a much bigger plate. India colliding with the Eurasian plate is basically kicking the boot, and Australia is the boot. So Australia is getting kicked upwards and colliding with the Pacific plate to the north, where there is a collision zone and a subduction zone. And the rate of convergence of the Australian plate with the Pacific plate to the north is about 15 centimetres per year, which is the fastest rate of convergence of any plate boundary in the world. So we have a very high strain rate as a result of that collision. It is responsible for forming the Owen Stanley Ranges, which travels down the back of Papua New Guinea. Owen Stanley Ranges are the fastest growing mountains in the world. They're growing at 7.5 centimetres per year. The 15 centimetres of uplift from the collision, minus 7.5 centimetres of erosion every year. By contrast, the Andes are only growing at about 2 centimetres per year, and the Himalayas similar. The European Alps are actually losing the battle to erosion, and they're actually getting smaller year on year. That results, the result of that collision is there's a very large amount of compressive stress in that roughly north-south direction on the Australian plate, and in particular the Australian continent. When we go over to the east, that boot is still kicking and hitting into the Pacific plate, forming another subduction zone, which is to the north of New Zealand. And that subduction zone is also resulting in a quite considerable horizontal stress. So when it's all said and done, Australia is a big slab of rock, which is under biaxial compression. It's being compressed rather strongly about 14 degrees east of north, and it's also got a fairly moderate lateral stress perpendicular to that as well. More careful observations by Reynolds and others from South Australia have resulted in the Australian stress map. This is a combination of observations from earthquakes, breakouts in drill holes, induced fracturing, overcoring, hydrofractures, and other geological indicators. And we can see that the principal stress directions do rotate a bit as we go around Australia, but generally speaking, the principal stress directions points towards the nearest plate boundary in all locations. That's what the stress field looks like. In the area that we're kind of interested in this kind of area, it's roughly this kind of semi-north-south kind of maximum compression with, as I said, quite a bit of lateral compression as well. Most of the people in this audience know what happens when you compress rock really, really slowly for a really, really long time. But just because I can't resist, how do I get that thing to play? Go back to, how do I do this? Here we go. All right, so I'm glad Stuart's not here today because there's a whole bunch of health and safety hazards here. But in any case, I might just mute on this one. What they're doing here is, probably have to do it on this side, I guess. Yeah. Okay, what they're doing here is they've got a hydraulic press. It doesn't have any lateral support. So a normal Instron UCS testing device will have lateral steel columns to prevent bad things from happening, but these guys obviously aren't too concerned. They're gradually increasing the stress. By about this time in the video, we're up at around 200 megapascals of stress being applied to this poor piece of granite. Is it still playing? Yes, it is. Okay. I'm just going to skip forward. So we're going to get up to about 350 odd megapascals. We'll start about here. And fairly soon things happen. All right, so that's what happens when you keep compressing rock for a really long period of time. It either fractures or it reactivates faults and produces earthquakes and rock bursts. Oop, okay. I'll just put my laser pointer back in case I feel inclined. Here's a list of some of the most notable earthquakes in Australia's history. If you look down that list, one of the first things you might notice is Tennant Creek, Tennant Creek, Tennant Creek. If you look even more closely, you might notice 1988, 1988, 1988. So these three earthquakes, all above magnitude 6, occurred within 12 hours of each other out in central Australia, in an area that had never shown any seismic activity in the prior time period that we know of. These earthquakes all just went bang, 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 right in the middle of the Australian continent, and they're still producing aftershocks to this day, which is quite astonishing 40 odd years later. So those may well have been what we call fault-forming earthquakes. So these were actual fracturing events. There's a lot of debate about that, and other people have other ideas, but that's one of the predominant ideas, is that these were actually forming new fault structures in the centre of the Australian continent. Others of note that some people may remember, I heard Dan talking about the Meckering earthquake before the presentation. That was a roughly magnitude 6.9 these days, revised to 6.5 earthquake in Meckering. That earthquake bent railway lines, and if you ever visit that area of Western Australia, a piece of bent rail track is still on display in the local Lions Park in the centre of town, as well as a pipeline that was shortened by that earthquake. We're talking, big steel pipe, and it's been shortened by 2 metres, and one piece of pipe telescoped inside the other piece of pipe. So we do have earthquakes that can produce quite considerable damage. Quite a lot of them to the east of Perth, in southern Western Australia, Merribee being another one, Collier Bay and Qd. But Northern Territory also features here. And if we go back a little bit further in history, there's some suggestion of magnitude 7 earthquakes in and around the Flinders Ranges and the Adelaide region as well as some 1800s earthquakes off the coast of King Island to the north of Tasmania. Some of you may remember this earthquake. I mentioned this one because it's a very good indicator of the damage that occurs as a result of an earthquake is very much tied to the exposure and the vulnerability of the populace. So this was an earthquake that occurred on the 21st of September 2021, magnitude 5.9, not that much bigger than the Kilkivan earthquake, to the north of Melbourne city, and right in the middle of COVID lockdown. This is a picture of a local cafe where the facade fell off the building. This is actually in one of the major streets in Melbourne, that at that time of day, on a weekday as this was, would have had a lot of pedestrians walking past at any given time. So there would have been injuries as a result of this earthquake, except everyone was at home doing what they were told. In the more surrounding region and close to the epicenter, there were landslips, landslides, there were busted chimneys, there were rock falls. So there was damage, but in a region where there wasn't great exposure of the populace or of the building stock. So we got lucky with that one. Regarding the Kilkivan earthquake, the head of natural hazards at Geoscience Australia was talking with me after the event, and he said it's pretty much about the best earthquake you can have. Big enough that lots of people feel it, but in a place that does almost no damage whatsoever. So we were very fortunate indeed with the Kilkivan earthquake. Here's a geology map of Brisbane. I like showing this. I show this to second year geoscience students at QUT every year when Scott Bryan asked me to come and talk to them about earthquake preparedness. I'd like you to focus in on this pair of red blobs here and the thick black line in the middle there. I know that's really fancy geological terminology, but if you look closely, you will see that this black line is called the North Pine Fault. These two red blobs are a granitic intrusion, Pluton. When it got intruded, it didn't have a discontinuity. It was probably intruded about 200 odd million years ago. The offset on that fault is now 11 kilometres. A magnitude 7 earthquake produces slip of about 1 metre. Those of you with a calculator, you can calculate how often a magnitude 7 equivalent earthquake has occurred on this structure in the last 200 million years. It comes out to about 20,000 years between magnitude 7 equivalent seismic activity. I won't say it was magnitude 7, it could be a whole bunch of smaller ones adding up. But that is also roughly the return period that we would estimate by looking at the long-term strain rate of the Australian crust. So a magnitude 7 earthquake in this region every 20 to 25,000 years. And that's been held up by some paleoseismology that's been done over in Western Australia as well, where they found ancient fault scarps and they've dug down and trenched them and looked for evidence of repeating earthquakes and dated them. This is the turn your head sideways and squint moment. If you turn your head sideways and squint, you may well notice that the seismicity in southeast Queensland is showing this general northwestern kind of trend, pretty much parallel with all the major faults that we can see in the geological map there, with some sort of semi-perpendicular kind of structures in amongst it as well. And if you're looking closely, you'll see that there are some fault jogs that go in that opposite direction. Out in the Diagular Range here, for example, there's a couple of examples of that. So what it's showing is the major faults we know of are active structures under the current stressing regime in this area. In fact, I did a study in 2006 using that elastic dislocation theory stuff again, where I took that fault map and I posed the question, what would need to be the maximum principal stress direction in order to activate the majority of those faults? So I asked the question in reverse. I did the calculations for all different possible orientations and magnitudes of principal stresses, and the answer came out north 14 degrees east, which is exactly the orientation, the maximum principal stress in southeast Queensland. So these faults are being loaded by the compression of the Australian continent. They're active. Okay, we'll go into a bit of history. I'm running out of time, but in any case, for a very long time during my time in seismology and throughout the last 90 odd years, we've talked about the Queensland earthquake or the Great Queensland earthquake. It was an earthquake that occurred in 1918. At that time, there were no seismometers in the state of Queensland. There was only one seismometer down in Sydney, in Parramatta, operated by a Jesuit priest. But it was widely felt through a very large region, and it produced a fair amount of damage, major damage nearby, widespread effects, and a significant aftershock sequence is the official record from the Queensland Earthquake Catalogue. At the time and through until very, very recently, we were of the belief that this earthquake occurred off the coast of Gladstone and was probably a magnitude 6.3 or similar. And that was based upon the observations of the priest down in Sydney, comparing the PNS times, and I think they had 3 seismographs, so we could get a bit of azimuth on it as well. A few years ago, around 2022, I think, there was a PhD student at ANU, Stacey Martin, who got very interested in relocating old earthquakes using anecdotal records and other ancillary information. He got in contact with me when he found out that I had a hoard of paper hiding in a storage room, which we'll talk more about later, including records of letters, correspondence, newspaper articles from that time period of the 1918 earthquake. Stacey did a great piece of detective work, fantastic seismological PhD. During the course of his work, he found the original seismograms from that seismograph in Sydney, but he also discovered that the military, the Navy, had just recently declassified a bunch of geophone records from that period and donated them to Geoscience Australia. And he found 3 more records of this earthquake that we didn't know about. He also reanalyzed all of the anecdotal information that I provided to him from UQ's collection. And he was able to show quite categorically that this earthquake did not occur offshore, but in fact occurred onshore, much closer to Gayndah. And that's actually changed the picture of the seismic hazard in that region quite considerably. We always held this earthquake up as the one we don't want to happen again, because Gladstone, of course, in this area is actually economically quite important to Queensland. We have ports, we have refineries, we have transport infrastructure, and a repeat of this earthquake could be economically at least quite a concern for Queensland for some time, if not a long time, if there was significant damage. Unfortunately, the new location brings it even closer. So the story has been noticed by the local and regional disaster coordination groups, and they are taking this into account in terms of updating their seismic hazard preparedness. Another one of note was almost twin of the Kilkivan earthquake, albeit 90 years ago. This one is auspicious, 4th of April 1935, about magnitude 5.5, and widely felt as far as what recorded in Perth, but felt in Brisbane and Toowoomba, and also down into northern New South Wales apparently. Essentially, it's the same earthquake, or very similar earthquake to the one that we had on the 16th of August of this year. If we put all the history together in that region, we won't talk too much today about the offshore events here, but these are magnitude 5 and larger earthquakes. There's the new 1918. There was one in 2015, 1935 Gayndah earthquake, and now the Kilkivan earthquake 2025. And I think you'll all agree that there's a sort of a line running through those that is on that northwestern trend again. So these are all likely earthquakes on the known Perry Fault or related structures. Okay, earthquake preparedness. So Geoscience Australia maintains the National Seismic Hazard Map. This basically makes use of probabilistic statistics on the past locations and sizes of earthquakes, as well as knowledge on the ground attenuation, ground shaking attenuation of rocks throughout the Australian continent, as well as some local site studies to map out the likelihood of there being ground shaking exceeding a certain value of peak ground acceleration within different return periods. The 500-year return period being one of the most common that earthquake engineers ask for. We want to know what's the maximum likely ground acceleration our building is going to experience in the next 500 years, and we'll build to that to make sure the hospital doesn't collapse in an earthquake. This is the same as this once in 100-year flood thing, right? This is the flood map for earthquakes, if you like. Okay, so estimating this seismic hazard involves convolving knowledge on the background seismicity, where it occurs, how big it's likely to be, and how often it occurs, with the attenuation that occurs as the waves travel from the earthquake to the site of interest, but also local site effects. So local site amplification is an effect where seismic waves travel through bedrock into a basin of sediment around a river or in a marina or at the beach, and those seismic waves become trapped within that sedimentary basin. And they bounce around, they constructively and destructively interfere. You get much longer duration of ground shaking in those areas and potentially much larger amplitude. So that's a big effect. It had a big effect in the Newcastle earthquake in 1989, and they look for that and incorporate that. Another big area of defence is in the way we build our buildings. This photograph is from Kobe in Japan from 1995. This is a street corner. It used to have 3 high-rise buildings. Now it's sort of got one and a pile of rubble and another one that's about to be torn down. These 3 high-rise buildings were all built at different time periods, the oldest building being this pile of rubble here, the newest being this nice glass and steel structure, and the one in between built to a intermediate earthquake loading code down the street a little bit. What's interesting about this is 3 structures built to 3 different engineering standards, all on the same street corner, all from the same earthquake. So the source effect, the path effect, and the local site effect are all the same for these 3 buildings. The first building was a complete fail. The second building down the street there, they had decided that having a soft story in the middle of a high-rise might actually damp out the shaking and prevent the collapse of the building. It worked for floors 3 and 4 above and floor 1 below, but floor 2, which was the soft story, is toast. It's now this sort of layer of rubble that you can see in the middle of that building. But those who were not on the soft story were able to exit the building. So in some respects, it was a win for earthquake engineering, but overall a fail. The most recent earthquake loading standard for Japan was applied in the design of this building, completely undamaged, same earthquake. So earthquake engineering makes a big impact on the total loss that occurs and also the potential for fatalities. Unfortunately, the earthquakes that produce the greatest fatalities are in places where the building code is either non-existent or not adhered to through lack of regulation and corruption. However, that's not the case in Australia. We do have a national construction code that must be adhered to, and we do have an earthquake loading standard. I'm not going to read through this, but these are basically the requirements. Low-story residential buildings, low occupancy buildings don't require any particular earthquake standard, but critical infrastructure like power stations, nuclear reactors, hospitals, ambulance stations and the like, all must be built to very high earthquake loading standards to ensure that they stay up in the event of a disaster. And high occupancy office buildings and residential buildings also require special earthquake conditions. Okay. In addition to that, earthquakes will happen. They're very low frequency, but very high consequence events. Insurance companies themselves don't keep a war chest for paying out earthquake damage, but they do insure themselves. So the insurance companies seek reinsurance from reinsurance companies. I'm waiting for the day that we have a reinsurer, but we don't at the moment. And there are 3 or 4 major reinsurance companies. They amass war chests for being able to pay out major disasters through a process of catastrophe bonds. Essentially, they ask investors that have a lot of cash that the investor wants to put in a place that's relatively safe with a moderate return. They ask them to gamble. So you can put your money into this catastrophe bond for this period of time. It's locked in. If the earthquake happens, you lose your money. If it doesn't, you get the money back with interest. And that's basically what a catastrophe bond is. And we do have catastrophe bonds covering earthquakes for different parts of Australia. Urban search and rescue is also something that Australia is very good at. Australia maintains a very high level of training and capability in urban search and rescue throughout most states. Queensland and New South Wales have internationally accredited disaster assistance response teams who are sent overseas to to assist in earthquakes like Christchurch, as depicted here, Turkey and Syria. These crews are really impressive. They can basically fill a C-130 with gear and be off the ground within 6 hours of the Prime Minister telling them that they've got permission to go. Very, very professional. It combines engineers and medics, paramedics. They have equipment, sniffer dogs, cadaver dogs. They have snaking equipment for snaking in under buildings, heavy lifting equipment. When they land in an area that's been devastated by an earthquake, they have all the gear to be completely self-sufficient. They take their water, they take their food, they take their power. The only thing they need is timber for shoring up structures. That's all they require from the local community. Very impressive crew. All right, finally, with not much time to spare, a brief history of seismology at UQ. And it starts with one W.H. Bryan. W.H. Bryan was a professor of geology and geophysics at the University of Queensland in the 1930s when the Gayndah earthquake occurred. I very much like this quote. During the past, there has existed very little interest in seismology. This lack of enthusiasm for a science that elsewhere has many ardent students is almost certainly due to the fact that perceptible earthquakes are of rare occurrence in Queensland. He goes on to talk about the 1918 earthquake and, of course, the most recent at that time, Gayndah earthquake. And he made use of that event and the interest that it generated to make a call to install seismometers in the state. As a result of that call, an anonymous benefactor contributed £100 to buy a Benioff seismograph. Now, £100 doesn't sound like very much, but it's about $20,000 in today's money, which is about what a seismograph costs today, by the way. In good academic spirit, when you get $1 of money, you go and find somebody else so you can double it. So that's exactly what W.H. Bryan did. He went to CSIRO as it was known at the time, and CSIRO contributed another £100 so they could get a pair of horizontal component seismographs located north, south, and east, west. Those seismographs were installed in the basement of the Chancellery of the university at the time, which happened to be at Gardens Point, where QUT currently is. So they hadn't moved to St Lucia, although they were starting to build the St Lucia campus at that time. Those two seismographs were later moved to St Lucia into a purpose-built vault behind the H.C. Richards building. But all the construction that went on after that in the 50s and 60s meant those seismographs were basically deaf. All they were hearing was just construction noise all the time, which is a bit similar to a memory of Bob Bryan, who was very kind to send me an email a couple of nights ago. And he remembers as a child helping his dad to change the records of those Benioff seismographs in the QUT Chancellery. And soon thereafter, when UQ was moving out, that building was a state high school. And at the end of each class, as the kids raced down the stairs, the Benioffs recorded many earthquakes. Part of the impetus for moving them. All right. The arrow is pointing downwards because it roughly reflects the trajectory of funding for seismology, but that's an aside. From 1935 to the 1950s, under the direction of W.H. Bryan, those seismographs were moved to UQ, and by 1960, the university had obtained a lease for Mount Nebo, and a seismograph was installed at Mount Nebo as well as one up at Charters Towers, and they became part of the worldwide seismograph network. The observations from these instruments were shared internationally, initially with the UK Seismological Agency and then the International Seismological Council, and helped to contribute to the worldwide effort to image the deep structure of the Earth using earthquakes. And that's how we know what the structure of the Earth is, by measuring the arrival times of earthquake phases from different earthquakes around the world and from different locations around the world. We were able to image or tomographically image the internal structure of the Earth So UQ had a big role to play in that throughout that early period. By the 1950s, we discovered that seismometers detect cyclones. And this was before we had any satellites giving us weather observations or weather imagery. And so W.H. Bryan and his successor, O.A. Jones, were able to get some funding to install seismographs for cyclone forecasting or cyclone tracking. Cyclones produce a particular kind of seismic wave called a T wave that strikes on the side of the Australian continental shelf, and that's detected by seismographs, and then they were able to use that to track cyclones before they were able to image them from space. This is the first of a number of examples where you have to be a bit ingenious to get funding for seismographs. The next major thing was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which allowed us to get funding for the Mount Nebo and Charters Towers seismographs that contributed to the worldwide seismograph network. In the 70s and 80s, we were building large water reservoirs in many parts of Queensland. When you impound a large dam with water, there's a huge amount of additional pressure on the crust, and it will quite often induce earthquakes within the crust underneath, called reservoir-induced seismicity. So we increased to about 20 odd seismographs as a result of that. Through the 1990s, at the time it was the Department of Mines that was operating these seismographs with the analysis being done by UQ. Through into the 90s, the state government decided to give the contract for monitoring earthquakes to the University of Queensland. That resulted in the establishment of the Quake Centre, which operated for a couple of decades. The Quake Centre appointed Professor Peter Mora to direct that centre, and Professor Mora had great interest in developing the capability for physics-based simulation of earthquakes. And so that centre changed its focus to that. That's where I come in as a PhD student. We were operating the whole network at the start. The contract got renewed in 2002, but given to the Seismological Research Centre in Melbourne. We lost the contract, which was pretty devastating for me. But I had a small contract with Gold Coast City Council and operated a network of 6 seismographs for them. And then that dried up as well. Since that time, with the help of people I should have mentioned, but I've run out of time, I continued to work towards ensuring that people didn't forget that earthquakes occur here, primarily working to raise awareness with state government agencies and emergency services. And through all of that time here at UQ, protecting the collection of seismological information that we'd gathered throughout all that 90-year history. Much of it was paper records, personal letters, felt reports, survey reports that we'd done for all the earthquakes that had been felt in Queensland through all that whole period. That collection, this was one of the better storage areas that UQ provided to me. That collection has been in danger of destruction numerous times. I've saved it from the tip about 3 times in my career already. I'm so pleased to be able to announce today that with the help of the Bryan Family Trust, an anonymous Queensland government sponsor, and a benefactor of the Bryan Family Trust, an organisation called Jigsaw Australia, we are in the process of digitising all of those records for the first time, and they'll form part of a digital data collection. Jigsaw Australia is a fantastic organisation. They're a training organisation for people with disabilities that provides clerical skills to upskill them so that they can gain gainful employment, and I'm very pleased to have them part of this story. I should have mentioned that that picture there is from 2 weeks ago, me packing up 14 boxes to send off to Jigsaw. And I think I got an email just before this meeting with access to the cloud storage for the first batch of digital data. So we got there in the end, we got there. Okay, what's the future? Or Dion's to-do list. Obviously, taking that digitised data and turning it into an actual curated digital data collection and making it freely available, probably through UQ eSpace, so that it can be used for future research by anyone who wishes to do so. I'm looking at the possibility of teaming up with the School of the Environment, hopefully, or perhaps WH Bryan Mining and Geology Research Centre to support HDRs to go back and reanalyse these old records and build a modern picture of the story that these records contain. I didn't mention the Wivenhoe Dam network, but that was part of this induced seismicity network. It was a fantastic array of seismographs set up and operated by the late Jack Rinn. It was actually upgraded in 2016 or thereabouts to modern equipment. And then unfortunately, Jack passed away. And a couple of years later, it was decided just to switch them off. And they're all just sitting out there, not doing anything right now. But I have the keys to the vault now. So we have hope that the Wivenhoe Dam network might actually come back alive fairly soon. And then there is the infamous pallet of orphan seismograms. So we had 20 pallets of seismograms that had been stored up over the decades. And at one point, we convinced Queensland State Archives to take 19 of the darn pallets, but not the 20. 19 of them had already been catalogued. We already knew which station and what time period of all of those seismograms. They took them quite willingly and put them into archives, but they wouldn't take this one because they were all orphan seismograms with different stations, different times. Guess why they were orphaned and why they weren't in the right place? That's the important stuff. And that's the Queensland earthquake catalogue right there. And in case you're wondering where it's located, that's my sunroom. Okay, thank you for your attention and apologies for going over the time.
Thanks, Dan. That was awesome. This question might be based on a flawed premise, but I notice, you know, you've got these orthogonal fault sets north of Brisbane, where with earthquakes occurring on them. If earthquakes are occurring on those faults, then the ones that are normal to the principal stress axis, you're going to get mostly dip slip movement along those faults, strike slip movement along the faults that are sort of more parallel to the principal stress axis.
Yeah, not quite, but keep going. Yep.
Well, you will get dip slip occurring on the
these
normal faults.
northwest trending faults, because of the high lateral compression, are actually reverse faults.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is dip slip movement.
Okay.
Yes. So do the faults with dip slip movement produce more damaging seismicity in that you've got more vertical component of movement than the strike slip faults? And if so, do the earthquake hazard maps reflect the orientation of the faults with respect to the principal stress axis on the?
Very, very local to the event. In other words, very near to the actual fault rupture itself. You're right that vertical movement is particularly damaging, particularly if you have, say, a dam wall crossing it. Dams don't like to be split in half like that. But overall, the amplitude and intensity of ground shaking in the surface waves, which are the building killers, is not that much different per magnitude, but we do actually have different ground shaking magnitude relationships for the different fault mechanisms, whether it be reverse fault, normal fault, or strike slip. Yeah.
And just a quick comment on your building code section.
Yeah.
The largest, or maybe second largest medical centre and university in South Australia, Flinders Medical Centre and University, basically straddles the most active fault zone in that part of the world. Like it's literally built across both sides of it. So I'm sure it's built to code, but I don't know if location selection is part of the code.
It probably wasn't for that particular one, but when they were talking about finding a location for certain kinds of green glowing waste, they were very much looking at what we know about the seismic history to try and find a location for that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dion, for educating us on earthquakes. We hope to see you next week. We have Luke Stannard from resolve mining solutions. He's going to talk to us about plan designs and what we need to do with regards to innovations. Hope to see you all. Thanks. Have a good